Hello everybody, I'm Colin D. Ellis and welcome to the Culture and Coffee podcast, where every episode I discuss a new topic of workplace culture and provide some insights and some practical things for you to do. Don't forget to like, subscribe and to share with people who you may think would be interested. Okay, let's get on with today's episode. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of the Culture and Coffee podcast. On today's session, I'm going to be talking about tracking employees and monitoring employees. Now, when I actually decided that I was going to do this session, I kind of had it in my mind that this was a relatively new area, that maybe it was something that was kind of during the pandemic, post-pandemic. Turns out it's been happening for years. And also during the pandemic, I read a really fascinating book around the rise of surveillance capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, which was really, really interesting about how technology companies are basically taking as much data as we can. So I suppose, a little bit naive, why wouldn't organizations do the same? And so I'm really going to talk to you about kind of tracking employees, why organizations do it, but principally the negative effects of it. It's an insidious practice and really undermines the kind of culture that most organizations need to create in order to deliver results. I think the other thing as well is I think many organizations think our employees won't care. And I think that's fair for maybe some of the older employees, even some of my age group, Generation X. But I think younger employees definitely will care a lot more. I think the assumption is that people will see technology in the future in the way that they see it today, and I'm not sure that that's true. So let's talk principally about why organizations do it. For me, there are three main reasons. So operations, so a kind of focus on day-to-day efficiency, and kind of maintaining a view of workflow, maintenance, tracking, that kind of thing. Often I'll work with, or have in the past worked with, engineering organizations, and they have the ability using various applications to track where vans are and if they're out on a job. And of course, that's just a way of tracking your employees. So they would say is that, from an operational perspective, they want to make sure that the right people are in the right place at the right time. All right. So that's operations is the first one. The second one is security. Security is there's this emphasis on protection and emphasis on risk mitigation. And that also covers kind of physical and digital security measures as well. So making sure, so for example, using like a virtual private network or a dongle, whatever you might call it, as a way of protecting sites, but also that device also sends information back so that people know. So the organization knows where did they log on, when did they log on, all of those kinds of things. And then the last thing is intelligence. And I think this is the area that is used the most and as the greatest grey area, because you could argue, and again, as a former senior leader myself, whenever I kind of do these sessions, I'm always empathetic to the needs of leaders within organizations or executives. I always am. Because I want to really understand, well, why would somebody do this? And the operations piece and the security piece, I understand the need for the information. I understand why they would use it. I'm not sure of how they would kind of track it and all of those kind of, but operations and security I can kind of get. Intelligence. So, this very much centers on what I would call, or what I have called, performance insights. But it's also linked to the intelligence. In other words, where is this person doing their work? Are they online? Are they offline? How much time do they spend on this application? When did they log on? When did they log off? Um, yeah. So they're the three areas really. And so I try to write down the value to the organization, workflow bottlenecks, I suppose, would be one. Safety monitoring for people who are out on their own. That's a good one. Verification of work hours and locations, grey area, like I mentioned. Um, Better dispatching and route optimization. Again, thinking of some of the clients that I've had in the past. I've worked with several distribution companies, so yes. Optimizing resource allocation. So kind of. There's definitely an argument for some of that monitoring, particularly where maybe you have vulnerable people going out on jobs and those kind of things. And so I was like, okay, well, how many organizations do we know that are actually using this kind of tracking? And so I found an Accenture survey from about 3 years ago, and they surveyed almost 1,500 executives. And what they found was that 62% of those organizations, so almost two-thirds, were actually using technology to monitor employee performance. And I was like, wow, that's pre-pandemic. It was end of 2019, so it was pre-pandemic. So when I came into writing the session, I thought, oh, all of this happened during the pandemic, but it's not. That was pre-pandemic. And at that time, only a third of them were confident that they were actually using them responsibly. Because of course, like anything, it's open to abuse. If someone's tracking your location, they can use it for nefarious reasons as well as potentially good ones. And that's before you take into consideration the pandemic. Now, what the pandemic did was accelerate our use of technology. And I've gone on record of this many, many times of saying, technology should have been adopted way sooner than it was, but there were a load of people holding it up for whatever their reasons were. The pace of digital transformation was so slow, and it was basically a bottleneck at the top. But of course, pandemic opened the doors, and everyone was like, "Oh, you can video conference. Oh, you've got chat tools." I'm like, "Well, duh, you've been able to do that for years." But fine, as someone who's using Microsoft Messenger in 2001. And so there was a survey done in the UK of over 2,000 workers, and 1 in 7 said that workplace monitoring and surveillance had increased during that time. And so, kind of what we saw then was people saying, okay, well, we can do this. And it's as simple as, is your light on in Teams? Right? There's the kind of red, amber, and green, or red. I think it's red, amber, and green. Red is offline, amber's away, green is online, something like that. I think that's. I use so many tools, I forget what it is. And so yeah, so I had a look at that, and then I was like, okay, well, there must be a report about have employee tracking tools, like the sales of those. And there was, I found a report, and sales of employee tracking tools have risen by as much as 300%, to the point where the US government have become concerned about it. Because the New York Times reported that 8 of the 10 largest private companies track their workers in one way or another. So the US government have kind of taken action, and they're really taking an interest in this. They don't want to see it. Well, not under the current administration. I'm recording this prior to the election in 2024. So what can we say? Well, we can say that quite categorically that employee tracking has increased, sales of the tools have increased, applications such as, so some applications, so Staff Cop. I mean, what a name for an application. Staff Cop, Terramind, Hubstaff, Clever Control, Time Doctor. I mean, they all sound really bad. It's, I reread. Well, actually, I didn't reread it. I listened to the audiobook of 1984 by George Orwell recently, and it's fascinating on so many levels. It's fascinating just how kind of ahead of his time Orwell was. But the inference in the book, if you haven't read it, and you should read it, like I won't lie, it's a hard read. A lot of what Orwell writes is a hard read, but they're still great. You should still read them. But a lot of what he writes, it's almost like a government control. So Big Brother is an individual, but he's kind of like a head of a big government department. I actually think Big Brother is the tech companies. I have to say, Steven Spielberg got it right. He said technology can be our best friend, and technology can be the biggest party pooper. And I really like that phrase. And if anyone's ever sat opposite someone on their device while you're having dinner, you know exactly what I mean. I'm in a hotel in London at the minute. I was down at breakfast this morning. Literally everybody was on their phones. Crazy. Now, of course, you might argue, well, Colin, tracking employees is nothing new. It goes all the way back to Ford's. They were doing it, in the early 20th century. Yes, they kind of were, but not technology. But I think in those days, it was kind of obvious. Now it's not so obvious. So, for example, if you have an ID card, when you tap in to get in, that it logs all of your data. When you tap in, when you tap off, people can see. Kind of where you were and when you were, and so this I decided to do this particular session because PwC in the UK recently announced that they were going to start tracking the location of the staff, the 26,000 staff, and there was a memo. I think it was Laura Hinton. She's a managing partner. She basically said we'll start. I've got an excerpt from the brief here. She said, we will start sharing your individual working location data with you on a monthly basis, as we do with other data such as chargeable hours. This will help to ensure that the new policy is being fairly and consistently applied across our business. Right. So basically they want to make sure that people are in the office. So what's the problem with all of this? Well, the problem is what you're basically saying by tracking your employees is we don't trust you, basically. And so it's not just PwC. It'd be unfair just to single them out. It's people like Lloyds Bank are also doing it. Yeah, and there was a report that British Telecom again in the UK are working on technology to continuously monitor workers at their laptops and PCs. My point with all of this is just because you can doesn't mean that you should. Supermarkets now, for those self-service checkouts, they now kind of capture your face. Kind of what's the rules around all that? How is that information held? For hotels, take a copy of your passport. These days, who's holding on to all that personal information? Anyway, I don't want to turn this into any kind of conspiracy theory. The point here is about culture. And so what you're basically saying is you don't trust your managers, you don't trust your staff. Because really, let's take the PwC example, just as an example. And like I said, it's not just PwC. There are other people who are doing it too. It would be unfair to single them out. But that was just the story that I read recently. Is that I think what they're keen to avoid is what's become known as hushed hybrid. And hushed hybrid is where the organisation says everyone has to be in 3 days a week, and then one manager will say, "Yeah, we're not going to do that. We'll just do our own thing." And consequently, you create what I call an uneven experience. And an uneven experience is where one team does one thing and one team does a completely different thing. And that's not great, and it's not good for culture either. But the root cause of that is managers who don't have the skill set to kind of motivate, inspire, to sell the value of why being together is really important for collaboration, but also for culture as well. Um, and so, the downside of tracking your employees is it's just an atmosphere of mistrust. It'll undermine psychological safety because you feel like you're being watched all of the time. What will happen is it'll give rise to kind of what should we call them, like productivity signals. Like you can buy these mouse mats now that continually jiggle the mouse to keep your Microsoft Teams light on green. So that they will, you'll have the rise of tools being sold to counter these monitoring surveillance, and people will be tapping in with two cards instead of one. um, the focus will shift to in this particular instance is being in a location rather than being kind of productive. There'll be a loss of autonomy, and there'll be a loss of control. And I think what will happen in the short term, actually, I don't think this will be a long term hit. I think there'll be a real reputation damage for those organizations who are surveilling their staff. I really, really do. What you want is to build a culture of trust. Now, I've spoken many, many times. I did it at a conference here in the UK last week. I talked about the importance of people being together in the same space. It's crucially important that that happens for certain things, not for all things. It's crucially important that employees recognize that they're one small cog in a big wheel, and it's not, the big wheel is not about them, they're part of it. But it's important for organizations also to sell the value of, kind of being in a place or doing particular work, or sell the value to the individual of why they would use these kind of tools. And that's not happening. It's all weighted in one direction. So I think what will happen is, as we've seen over the last kind of couple of years, is particularly for the younger employees, millennials, Gen Z, is they'll start writing about these things on Glassdoor, which is a website where kind of younger people are going now to find out, well, what do I need to know about this organization before I apply for a job here? I think media will be fascinated with this. The only reason that I found out about PwC and Lloyd's Bank was the fact that they were in the media for tracking their employees. I think potentially that it's open to legislation in the future, and my views on legislating business are it's wrong, we shouldn't have to do it. But actually, if businesses were responsible in the first place, then they wouldn't be open to legislation. The same as, I believe the same with the right to disconnect rule. There's no way governments around the world should be telling organizations to not email their staff after hours and phone them after hours. It just shouldn't happen. Organizations should kind of have a conscience and want to do the right thing. So I think, instead leaders should focus on educating people on the value. They should focus on educating managers on how to manage expectations. They should create a culture of togetherness, not silos, where you get this kind of hushed hybrid. And also there should be performance management where people are selfish and just want to do their own things. I talked to a lady last week, and she said it was really frustrating. As their organisation had mandated days back in the office, she asked me for my, kind of opinion on that. And she said, one of the things that's undermining the culture at the minute is two or three people just do their own thing, and they're never held to account. And that's wrong. You can't have one rule for one and one rule for everybody else. And it doesn't matter where they sit in the hierarchy. So I think, kind of, yes, surveillance will breed compliance, but what it will do is it will kill trust, and it will suffocate the culture, and it will lead it to stagnate. And I think as well, when kind of tracking replaces trust, then any kind of psychological safety dies, because you always feel like the organization is watching you. Winston Smith in the book, in the George Orwell book, he was in 1984. I forgot the name of the book then. Winston Smith, he was the key character. He just wanted to escape. He just wanted to get away. And the thing is employees can do that. they can go to other companies that don't track their employees. And actually the organizations that will win from a culture perspective, from a talent perspective, are the ones that build culture in a humane way. They teach their managers the basic skills required such that they never have to track their employees ever. And I've worked with some fantastic organizations who've actually maintained the culture that I've helped them to build for themselves. And they don't need to track their employees. They don't need to mandate days in the office. What they've got is employees who understand the value of being together. They understand the importance, or they understand the value of why that particular piece of tracking software is important. The engineers I was talking about why, kind of safety on a job. A lot of people face physical threats. I spoke at a retail conference recently. They're talking about the abuse and physical threats that retail staff get. It's like, oh my, what kind of world do we live in now where that's become the standard? But it's the same with, if you're out on a job at night in the winter and it's dark, and especially for females, you want to know that you're safe. And if that bit of monitoring software can help, great. You understand the value. It's the nefarious stuff that really bothers me. Nefarious is my word of the day here, is where employees are tracking you and either not telling you, or there's no material value to the employee. It's all weighted one way. And in those instances, as I said, it will undermine trust. It will suffocate culture. It will lead to talent loss. And ultimately organizations will then create toxicity. It will make it into the media. It will force them into a rethink. And then they'll spend 12 to 18 months trying to backtrack in the hope of attracting high performance talent all over again. Okay. Hope you enjoyed today's session. Look forward to the next one.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. If you'd like to find out more about how I can help you transform the culture of your team, head to my website at www.colindellis.com.